In 1994, a game debuted on the PC-98 platform named Policenauts. Later ported onto multiple platforms, Policenauts was never officially released in the West. But its influence on the future games of Hideo Kojima would be felt all the way to his most recent game, Death Stranding. In this video, I'll be providing a complete synopsis of Policenauts, as well as going into some of its themes, why it mattered, and how it connects to other Kojima games. Let's begin. Policenauts is a sci-fi buddy cop hybrid story told through a very Hideo Kojima-style adventure game framework. It's also a borderline eroge or erotic visual novel, though that doesn't stop Policenauts from having a heart. Our story begins in 2013 when, in a nod to the famous American astronaut team the Mercury 7, 5 cops from around the world are trained to become the first space police force, or Policenauts. This coincides with the completion of humanity's first space colony, Beyond Coast, in 2010. However, during a live broadcast of a field test for the new extravehicular mobility police suit prototype Yuri, test pilot and policenaut Jonathan Ingram suffers a critical malfunction. He winds up lost in space, frozen in cold sleep for 25 years. When Jonathan's rescue ball gets recovered, he stayed exactly the same. Yet everything else over the 25 years has of course changed. His former wife Lorraine and his old partner and fellow policenaut Ed Brown both now live on Beyond. Unable to join them due to his crippling post-accident cosmophobia, Ingram turns his back on his old life and becomes a private eye. Jonathan makes a living in the crime-infested, decaying slums of old LA. But it's there his old life comes back to haunt him. The game begins in a film noir fashion as Ingram's ex-wife Lorraine shows up and asks you to investigate the disappearance of her second husband, Kenzo Hojo. Hojo works for the biggest conglomerate in space, one formed by a fellow policenaut, Joseph Sadaoki Tokugawa. His Tokugawa group handles everything from heavy industrial manufacturing to pharmaceuticals. In some ways, Tokugawa runs Beyond and rules over space no less completely than his namesake, Japanese Emperor Ieyasu Tokugawa, did way back when. Lorraine gives you the only clues her husband left her: half a leaf, a pair of strange pill capsules, and a word: Plato. Whether you accept the case or not, right after this, Lorraine is suddenly killed right outside your office by a car bomb. You track the culprit and engage them in a shootout, finding they have superhuman stamina and mysterious white blood. But the culprit escapes on motorbike, leaving Jonathan with no choice but to venture back into space, the place where life as he knew it came to an end. On board the interplanetary flight to Beyond, Ingram finds himself sitting next to a strange, pale figure by the name of Tony Redwood. Redwood's a frozener, genetically engineered post-humans that the government of Beyond breed for work that normal humans can't do well. That's only your first glimpse at how much things are changing on the space colony. The climate of Beyond Coast is directly modeled on the West Coast. And as a colony run by the Japanese corporation Tokugawa, many aspects of Beyond Coast resemble Japan as well. The Beyond Coast Police Department, or BCPD, are in charge not only of police activities, but military operations as well. Redwood, it turns out, is a member of an all-frozener next-generation police forces unit called AP, Advanced Police. In charge of BCPD is yet another former policenaut, Becker Gates. Your old partner from back in the LAPD, who also became a policenaut with you, Ed Brown, is the first person that Ingram wants to see, but his dreams of reliving the duo's glory days are crushed when it turns out Ed has, in the last 25 years, fallen pretty far from grace. Now assigned to the loser unit of BCP, the Vice Squad, Ed's half the cop he used to be. A traumatic showdown with a crazed perp several years back left Ed incapable of firing a gun, as he's taken in the orphan, who the incident left a mute, Mark. Ed just wants to raise Mark and his college student daughter Anna in peace, to honor the memory of his wife who died some years ago. Jonathan has to snap Ed out of his complacency and enlist the help of not only the other two in the Vice unit, Meryl and Dave, but also BCP's coroner and forensic pathologists, Victor Jurgens. Together, the ragtag team tries to take on the mystery of Hojo's disappearance and Lorraine's death, but only in an unofficial capacity. Gates can't risk pissing off Tokugawa by doing anything more. Victor runs the leaf and capsules through his auto-analysis identification device. Being Russian, Victor named his machine after the last leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev. All 4 capsules seem to just be run-of-the-mill Tokugawa brand pharmaceuticals, with one curious detail. Their drug ID codes are missing sections of the Tokugawa logo in chiral pairs. That is to say, each of the pairs resemble a left and a right in terms of the missing portion. As for the leaf, Victor tells you it definitely comes from a black poppy, the raw material for a semi-synthetic illegal narcotic known as narc. Narc isn't just a street drug, it's informally known as simply the drug on Beyond. Combining the properties of an opioid and a hallucinogen, narc is perhaps the biggest illicit substance on the interstellar black market. And the leaf shows signs that it was space-grown, which in this day and age should be unthinkable. Just where was this black poppy cultivated? And why is this only half of a leaf? And even more importantly, where the hell is Hojo? Lorraine was convinced that he was killed, but Victor and Ed explained that if he was killed on Beyond, the odds of his body remaining hidden here are low. It's more likely that if Hojo's dead, the perpetrators must have moved him off-world first. And much like the presence of the black poppy, that implies the involvement of organized crime, as well as the ubiquitous company known only as the Group, Tokugawa. Traveling to Hojo's office and Beyond Coast Hospital, or BCCH, Jonathan and Ed start to piece things together. It turns out Hojo was a very important designer in Tokugawa's pharmaceutical division. His K-series of DDS, or drug delivery systems, pioneered new methods of precision in terms of triggering how a given drug activates in the body. But of all the K-series DDS methods, the newest one, K9, turns out to still be a secret. At Hojo's office, you find a whiteboard that reads 100 sets of K9, the secret new version of DDS, was scheduled to be sent to BCCH, or Beyond Coast Central Hospital, on the very day that Hojo disappeared, the 15th. That takes you to Jun Ishida, the BCCH pharmacist. He explains that K9 is just a version of DDS that works even in zero gravity by using osmotic pressure. But curiously, Ishida claims that on the 15th, the last time it seems anyone saw Hojo alive, he only brought in 3 samples of K9 for data gathering. Given K9's not even on the market yet, 100 doses is surprisingly large, so where are the missing 97? And why was Hojo apparently bringing so many of these over to BCCH? Ingram and Brown begin to rapidly unravel a conspiracy implicating the Tokugawa group. Heading to the company's HQ, the Prop, which has record of Hojo recently visiting but never leaving, Jonathan confronts the man himself, Satoaki Tokugawa. It's in the middle of a huge launch party for the DDS innovation and for a new Tokugawa brand EMPS. Present are also a variety of scumbags from both Beyond Coast and Earth, or as it's now informally known here, home. Tokugawa claims he never met Kenzo on the 15th, the day that he went into the corporate HQ and never came out. He also claims the party here in the Prop is to celebrate the completion of K9, which will allow drugs to be effective even in weightlessness. The EMPS that's present there, meanwhile, is a military prototype created by Tokugawa Heavy Industries. It seems the company has plans to expand and become Space's not only one and only pharmaceutical company, but also its one and only member of the military-industrial complex. Why is Tokugawa acting like the fact that Hojo, his most important developer and the one behind K9, has gone missing isn't a cause for concern? And what is he doing here with the head of BCCH, Chris Goldwyn, and former fellow Policenaut Salvatore Toscanini, head of Tokugawa's moon-based security force, let alone with members of the Mafia from Earth? The whole thing stinks, and you tell Tokugawa that directly. That gets you and Ed promptly kicked out. It's obvious something's up with Tokugawa, but to find out exactly what, you now have to visit Lorraine and Hojo's orphan, Karen Hojo. Initially, she despises you, but eventually she starts to come around. Karen suffers from a rare condition called aplastic anemia, caused by space radiation. It seems Kenzo was working so hard for Tokugawa because of a promise to bump Karen up the list for its bone marrow donors he was given. And now that he's gone, there's no telling whether Karen will live or die. It all depends on whether or not she can find someone with matching bone marrow stem cells. Karen's the host of the colony-wide show News Order on the local channel Beyond Coast Broadcasting, or BBC. Though the real Karen is sick, BBC has her body double, really a simulation of Karen generated by AI, hosting the news. Going off tips from an informant who meets you at the Astronauts Memorial Museum and goes by 9 stars, Ed and Jonathan put together that evidently searching for Hojo's body is a waste of time, but that's as specific as he's willing to get. 9 stars points you in the right direction. Thanks to Karen letting you search the house, you find a secret disc that's the key to unlocking the first part of the Tokugawa puzzle. This antiquated CD technology Hojo used was to limit where it could be accessed. Only the Tokugawa Group's internal network terminals, the T-Gear 99, you see, have the right hardware to read it. Technically, it's a modified CD-ROM that only one of these machines can access. The CD you found in Hojo's house turns out to be a sales demo for K9, that secret DDS method I mentioned earlier. But the CD also reveals that Tokugawa aren't just a pharmaceutical company or any of its other many legal enterprises. They're also the biggest, if not the only, illegal drug dealers in space. All of the K-series DDS prototypes were really methods of devising the perfect undetectable narcotic, and K9 is the pinnacle. As a so-called binary narcotic, K9 requires the user to take a set of activators, distinguished by their corresponding halves of the Tokugawa logo for their drug ID code. Taken separately, they're totally inert. It's undetectable because they only chemically activate as narc once both pills are safely inside the body. Kenzo left Lorraine a half-cut black poppy leaf as a further hint that the drug works via binary activation. You return to BCP to talk to Victor about the CD's revelations, but mysteriously he says AP, that high-tech next-gen special police unit, confiscated the pills you gave him. And when you go to Redwood to get them back, the capsules he gives you are missing the binary drug IDs. Clearly, AP and Redwood are wrapped up in all of this. Suddenly, Meryl tells you 9 stars just left a message that something's come up, that you need to meet him back at AMM after hours for an urgent talk. You arrive to find a severed head floating among the planetary displays. It belongs to 9 stars, the man who dragged Hojo into betraying Tokugawa, Jun Ishida. The BCCH's chief pharmacist, Jun Ishida, angry at being forced to work at BCCH, where his brilliance would go ignored, convinced Hojo to start selling K9 on the side. That's where the missing 97 sets of K9 went. It was this that got him killed. It's then Lorraine's killer returns, luring you into a sadistic time bomb trap and getting Vice member Dave killed. After the police chase and bomb disposal, it's becoming pretty clear that the person who killed Lorraine, who may have killed Ishida and definitely just tried to kill you and Ed, is none other than Redwood, the Frozener from AP. But what does Tony Redwood have against you, and why did he come all the way to Earth just to kill Lorraine? Further investigation is needed, especially as Dave's body goes missing. Evidently, they hid him inside one of AP's EMPS's, but to what end? Undeterred, you manage to get inside Tokugawa's secret drug manufacturing plant, proving once and for all that they are behind the narc epidemic. Telling Gates, Ed and Jonathan rally all of BCP to the facility. But by the time they arrive, all trace of illegal drug cultivation there is gone, replaced instead by the bullet-riddled body of Kenzo Hojo. Even worse, the bullet wounds on his body seem to match your gun, as Jonathan is the only one on Beyond who still uses a recoil gun with gunpowder. Behind this ruse is not only Tokugawa, but also Gates. After the fiasco of your armed police chase, Gates confiscated your gun. He only gives it back, it seems, to frame Ingram for the murder of Hojo. Obviously, Tokugawa used your gun to shoot Hojo's body while it was in BCP's possession. Gates also pins the bomb on you, claiming that's how you knew how to defuse it. And conveniently, the bike that the perp, most likely Redwood, used during that violent shootout was smuggled onto Beyond inside the same space plane you took to get here. That leaf Hojo gave Lorraine came from the synthetic biopoppy used to make the street drug that's all the rage, narc, and the pills he gave are really samples of K9. The only question is, what's the meaning of Play-Doh, the word that Hojo also gave to Lorraine along with the pills and the leaf of the poppy? Framed for the murder of his ex-wife's husband, Ingram's fate seems sealed. But his friends manage to sneak him and Ed onto Tokugawa's moon base, disguised as tourists. Together, the two sneak into a horrifying secret facility full of floating bodies. It turns out that Plato crater on the moon is where Tokugawa have built a secret facility for trafficking organs. Some of their subjects are kept there as biomorts or brain-dead zombies, but others are merely corpses that Tokugawa harvests from the morgue of BCCH. This was the real darkness Tokugawa killed Hojo after he found out to keep secret. They kept Hojo in a brain-dead coma as a biomort in this plant. Sadly, it's also how your friend and ally, Victor, will wind up too, for helping you. The biomorts come not only from Beyond, but also from Earth, where they're shipped to the moon by the mob. It's in the same facility that you find Dave, and it's here where Tokugawa were able to keep Hojo on ice for so long. Tokugawa's thug and former policenaut Salvatore Toscanini is in charge of security for the moon base, and he catches you and Ed in the secret plant. Toscanini explains that from the mental impact of the extreme loneliness of space to the physiological impact of things like cosmic radiation and zero gravity, which even have effects on your DNA, Tokugawa's drugs and organs are merely fulfilling essential human needs in the era of life after Earth. Apart from organ harvesting, Tokugawa also used the biomorts for producing hormones or testing experimental drugs. Tokugawa had it all planned 30 years ago, and he convinced the other policenauts to cause your accident because he knew that you and Ed were the only ones who wouldn't go along with his plan. Ed and Ingram hatch a plan to expose Tokugawa and clear Jonathan's good name. But Ed gets badly hurt and put on life support, right alongside a nearly as imperiled Karen. To lure Ed into the line of fire, someone dressed in 9 Stars spacesuit showed up at AMM with Mark. It was then Redwood showed up out of the blue and shot Ed. Mark draws you a picture of Redwood, the spacesuit, and a flower that Ed's daughter Anna identifies as lavender. Putting the pieces together, you have to deduce the ID of the person in the spacesuit. It goes back to the smell in the air when you first met BCCH head Chris Goldwyn. It was lavender, a perfume she wears to cover up the smell of the dead. Running to Ed's bed, you just barely stop Goldwyn from finishing the job. She confesses everything. A former idol fallen from grace, Chris is an expert at organ transplantation. Apparently, the man who killed Lorraine was a frozener created from urogenetic material, a frozener named Redwood. In order to stay close to her surrogate son Redwood, she agreed to help Tokugawa harvest organs at BCCH. Redwood also has some connection, it turns out, to Mark. Ed got hurt because he couldn't shoot Redwood. The reason goes back to the traumatic showdown that first introduced Ed to his adopted ward, Mark. Mark's father, it turns out, was none other than Redwood's older twin, Tony Redwood, and that makes Redwood Mark's uncle. Squaring off against first Redwood, you trick Gates into admitting everything live, broadcasted all throughout the colony. At the end, Gates gives a speech about why Tokugawa have done what they've done, very similar to the speech that the Patriots give at the end of MGS2. After pontificating on the nature of human evolution beyond the stars, Gates explains Hojo wanted to leave the DDS program, and then found out about the organ trafficking. That's because Tokugawa told him so he'd realize how it might save Karen. But instead, it just made Hojo terrified. Realizing he wouldn't see reason, Tokugawa then put him in a state of drug-induced brain death. They then later used his body to frame you for Hojo's murder. Tokugawa's plans are then foiled, and Ed recovers. So does, for that matter, Karen, after you provide her the necessary stem cells for the treatment. It turns out Ingram has all along had a second child on Beyond, Karen herself. With Lorraine's dying wish fulfilled, Jonathan bids goodbye to Ed and returns home. The game ends. So why did Policenauts matter? Well, to begin with, it was the first game Kojima and his team made from the ground up for the disc medium. By the PlayStation and Sega Saturn ports, Policenauts was the first game with art by Yoji Shinkawa. Several voice actors would return for not only 1998's Metal Gear Solid, but in multiple MGS games throughout the years. And both formally and technologically, Policenauts was MGS's predecessor in several ways. Policenauts was Kojima's first attempt at a full-blown cinematic game, apart from the remake of Snatcher on the PC Engine, that is. And though Policenauts doesn't use 3D real-time rendering, there's a seamlessness between the visual style of gameplay and cinematics that directly anticipates MGS1. There's also Policenauts' status as a multi-process story, which MGS1 and Kojima's later games would all largely follow. This has become synonymous with a Hideo Kojima game. A multi-process story is when little details change relative to playstyle, while the main story remains relatively linear. Examples of this in Policenauts are everywhere, but one of my favorites happens during the extremely difficult bomb disposal mission. If you die, Ingram and Ed will break the fourth wall and acknowledge it in several different lines of dialogue depending on how many times you die. The characters themselves would return under various guises and reinterpretations in later games too. Jonathan and his mullet would become part of the basis for the MGS1 era Solid Snake. Although it should be admitted that it was Snake in the earlier MSX games who first used a Beretta 92F and chain smoked. Ed would come back in a much wiser state in MGS2 and voiced by the same actor as part of the inspiration behind NYPD bomb disposal advisor Peter Stillman. Back during Ed's Bomb Squad days, he had a similar confrontation with fear and darkness as Stillman. Both men are haunted by the sins of their pasts. Meryl, of course, would return whole cloth in MGS1 and later MGS4, even using the same voice actor. In Policenauts, her tough exterior is cracked by the death of Dave, while in MGS1, it's her own near-death experience that leads Meryl to re-examine herself. Snake in MGS1, of course, is also named Dave. The importance of the character Karen Hojo for later games is illustrated simply by the crucial roles that the same voice actor has played in MGS. Kikuko Inoue has played Rosemary, the boss, and even Shiko. Karen herself also directly seems to have influenced the character Naomi, who pines for vengeance against Snake, much how Karen initially did for Jonathan. But setting aside the question of voice actors, Easter eggs and allusions to Policenauts are everywhere in MGS. Raiden somewhat resembles a Frozener with his white blood and the barcode on his body. The traitorous Becker Gates resembles Major Zero, and even Cypher, the Patriots, and the Philosophers are all prefigured somewhat by Policenauts' shadowy cabal behind the scenes. Originally, a broadcast about Arsenal gear slamming into Manhattan would have featured Karen Hojo at the end of MGS2. Ed and Jonathan even discuss at one point VR training and how it's nothing compared to live fire exercises. This of course anticipates the themes of MGS2. The name Tokugawa Heavy Industries consequently would be all over the big shell in that game, implying that Tokugawa built the facility. And the floating bodies in MGS-V's Maffinda oil refinery resemble the black poppy pods we see floating in Tokugawa's secret narc processing plant. There are optional dialogue and even cutscenes, like this one with Dave in the shooting range, that would prove similar to all the missable cutscenes in future Kojima games like The Phantom Pain. MGS would inherit Policenauts' insane level of detail when it comes to technical subjects and disciplines. Naomi knows as much about genetics as there is to learn in Policenauts about pharmacology and space travel. Jonathan and Ed would return for cameos in MGS4, and even by The Phantom Pain, we find Venom Snake wearing the same old-school pilot goggles as Dave, perhaps foreshadowing his martyrdom. The motif of undetectable narc pills would clearly go on to inspire many of the doomsday scenarios in MGS, from Metal Gear Rex's stealth nuke to Skullface's plan to proliferate undetectable metallic archaea for making weapons-grade uranium. And the biomorts on the moon strongly resemble the people laid out in rows inside the Devil's House in The Phantom Pain. But even Death Stranding is full of nods to Policenauts. Sam, after all, is a repatriate, a word that in Policenauts referred to an extremist movement against all forms of space exploration. The acronym DDS would return in Death Stranding as Delivery Dependence Syndrome. And in a way, the central problem faced by the post-Stranding society of logistics that porters solve is a lot like a scaled-up, societal-wide version of the drug delivery system in Policenauts. The hormonal imbalances and other struggles that humanity face in Death Stranding's version of a near future lost in space-time strongly echoes the difficulties we see in the near future of Policenauts when it comes to life among the stars. Deadman in a way resembles Victor, both of them being morticianers at one point or another. And the way the Death Stranding has dislodged America from time and place is a lot like Jonathan's disastrous 25 years spent in cryosleep. Fragile's health issues recall Karen's, while the character Hartman has stacks of old media exactly like Kenzo Hojo did. Ironically, while in Policenauts, Hojo's family are trying to solve his murder, in Death Stranding, Hartman is trying to connect with his own family from beyond, who they, not he, have died. And of course, the gradual revelation that Sam is Cliff's son is similar to how Ingram discovers Tony Redwood is his son, too. The way we see Amelie and Bridget at dramatically different ages recalls Lorraine and Karen, who are also doppelgangers. There's also the importance of photographs in Policenauts, MGS, and Death Stranding. Policenauts would also leave its mark in all the many sexual situations you can find yourself in while playing Kojima's other games. Policenauts was about the future. How well can humanity adapt to totally alien conditions? And how much of our nature will always stay with us? These would be questions that would be asked again by the following Kojima game, 1998's Metal Gear Solid. And virtually every Kojima game, since Policenauts, would repeat its basic conflict as a depiction of society, one trapped between progress and morality, human ambitions and hubris, orthodoxy and sin. There's also the importance of Policenauts as a very early attempt at what by today has become cliché, the cinematic game. The design question for Policenauts was whether a game initially made for the PC-98 computer series could really emulate the immersive, almost transcendental quality of Hollywood movies. This we can see not only in the game's rather grand soundtrack, but also in its foundation in the style and even climate of LA. Kojima would return to this same general foundation for MGS2, the so-called Hollywood game, and to some extent MGS3, perhaps the ultimate cinematic action game. And there's even that signature Kojima motif of matching form with content and breaking the fourth wall in Policenauts. The game's structure is circular, both like the rotation of a planet and the shape of a CD. The setting of space integrated well with the slow load times and limitations presented by the PC-98 platform. Meanwhile, the exquisite pixel art not only brought the story of Policenauts to life, combing the screen for details became a key aspect of playing the game. Just like Snatcher and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake before it, there's even a fourth wall breaking scenario that involves the very hardware on which you're playing the game. Themes would also evolve from Policenauts over time. Themes like, what kind of future are we building? What are the ways that utopias can become dystopias? And how can the illusion of peace be exploited as a means to power? In all these ways and more, Policenauts was very important to every Hideo Kojima game that followed it. And hopefully after this video, it's clear why. If you're going to play it, I recommend the Sega Saturn version the most. Until next time, boss.